Welcome to Occult Archives. Now, forget everything you think you know about the devil.
Okay.
You know, like the horns, the pitchfork, the whole fiery pit thing.
Right.
It's so much more than that.
Yeah.
Today, we're taking a deep dive into the concept of ultimate evil.
Yeah, ultimate evil.
We're going to explore how humanity has wrestled with this idea across different cultures and times, shaping religious beliefs and societal fears. We'll see how it's not just a static idea of some red guy with horns, but a constantly evolving concept, sometimes terrifying, sometimes surprisingly necessary to the cosmic drama.
Yeah, you hit the nail on the head there. And to uncover these unexpected twists and turns, we're going to be looking at some really fascinating historical texts, including one called Demonology and Devil-Lore, Volume 2.
That sounds promising.
It really is.
So get ready to challenge some of your assumptions as we journey from ancient myths to complex theological concepts, exploring the devil's many guises and the surprising roles this figure has played throughout history. We'll be seeing how civilizations from Persia to early Christianity grappled with the problem of evil and how they personified its power.
Exactly. And what's really fascinating is how these different cultures actually influenced each other's ideas about the devil.
So are you saying there's a sort of shared history of the devil?
There is, in a way. It's like a dialogue across time and cultures, with each civilization contributing to the evolving understanding of evil.
That's amazing. All right, let's get into it.
Starting
with, let's talk about the dragon.
Oh, the dragon.
The dragon.
This is a great place to start because you can really see how a symbol that was initially tied to earthly power struggles, kings fighting over land and all that undergoes this incredible spiritual transformation.
A spiritual glow-up almost.
Exactly, yeah. As the Book of Revelation describes it, the dragon shifts from battling for territory to becoming this cosmic adversary who is actually fighting against humanity's salvation. This creature becomes known as the accuser and the deceiver, setting the stage for this massive apocalyptic showdown.
That's a pretty big promotion for a mythical beast.
It is.
From this overthrown dragon, we get this kind of unsettling duo of evil.
Yes, you do.
We've got the seven-headed, ten-horned beast, all about wrath and destruction.
Right. Pure aggression.
Yeah. And then, maybe even creepier, you've got this lamb-like beast with two horns, achieving deception not through brute force, but through illusions and miracles, even calling down fire from the sky.
That's right, yeah. It's like evil evolves from straightforward aggression to something way more subtle and insidious. This lamb-like beast really embodies that shift.
That is terrifying. Now, let's take a trip eastward to ancient Persia. They had a very different way of looking at this whole good versus evil thing, didn't they?
They did. And it's really interesting how their understanding is rooted in the natural world, like darkness, cold, even death itself.
So they didn't see the devil as some fallen angel, like in the Christian tradition.
Not exactly. Their devil, Ahriman, was more like the embodiment of these natural forces, the gloom of darkness, the sting of death, the stuff that just inherently makes life difficult.
I see.
He's a direct contrast to Ormuzd, the good spirit who created light, darkness in its good form, like sleep and waking. They represent this fundamental duality that's woven into the very fabric of existence.
So good and evil as essential parts of the universe.
Exactly, yeah. And even before these two, the Persians had this concept of boundless time, or Zera and Akrin, from which both Ormuzd and Ahriman emanated.
Wow. So even time itself is a source of this duality.
In a way, yes. It's like these two spirits, good and evil, are inherent to the very nature of reality, going all the way back to the beginning.
And how do they see the relationship between these two spirits playing out?
Well, Ahriman, driven by jealousy of his brother Ormuzd, was condemned to 12,000 years of darkness.
That's a long time.
It is a really long time, and this becomes the cosmic stage for their ongoing conflict. Ormuzd, on the other hand, creates the pure spiritual world as a way to ultimately overcome Ahriman. He even raises up this massive mountain, Alberj, to help him in this cosmic battle.
A cosmic mountain. I mean, this sounds like some serious epic level stuff.
It really is. The Persians saw this as a struggle playing out on a grand scale, with the fate of the universe hanging in the balance.
And what's the final resolution in this whole cosmic drama?
So eventually, the visible universe gets consumed by fire from a comet.
Whoa.
Yeah, but this fire isn't just destruction, it's actually a purification. And from this, Ormuzd sends his prophet, Sosioc, to convert humanity to the true law.
I see. So kind of like a cosmic reset button.
That's a great way to put it. Now, another interesting thing is how the Vedic serpent Ahi, who is associated with suffering and chaos, gets transformed in an Iranian mythology into this whole infernal region called Dusak.
So the serpent image is evolving, but it's still connected to evil.
Exactly, yeah. The serpent, or the dragon, keeps popping up, but its meaning shifts and changes depending on the culture and the time period.
Fascinating. Now, what about the nature of evil itself? How did the Persians understand that in relation to their devil, Ahriman?
Well, their ancient texts, the Avesta, seem to suggest that Ahriman loves evil for its own sake, even describing him as embodying the stings of conscience beneath external pleasure. So it's like he gets satisfaction from causing suffering, even experiencing it himself. But later theological ideas soften this stance a bit, suggesting that evil wasn't inherent to Ahriman's being, but more like a choice, a deviation from the fundamental goodness represented by Ormuzd.
So there was a debate even within their own tradition about whether evil was an essential part of Ahriman or something he chose?
Right, a really interesting theological nuance. But regardless, this brings us to a bigger question. This human tendency to personify abstract concepts, especially when we're talking about good and evil, why do we do that?
You're talking about the birth of a supreme principle of wickedness.
Exactly. Yeah. It's like whenever something good or true emerges, we almost automatically create an adversary, an opposite force. It's like a psychological need for balance, played out on this grand moral and spiritual stage. This is how we get figures like the devil, an official accuser of innocence, a tempter of virtue, who, rather disturbingly, gets satisfaction from punishing humans for the very sins he tempted them to commit.
Oh, wow. So he's not just the source of temptation, he's also the punisher.
Exactly. The devil, or whatever name a culture gives to this principle of evil, becomes at once man's creature and his tyrant.
That is a scary thought.
It is. And this personification, this giving a name and an image to evil, inevitably leads to anything opposing it being labeled as bad or base.
Like if you're against the good guys, you must be with the bad guys.
Right, a very binary way of thinking. And often, this opposition gets personified as well, frequently using the names and titles of older fallen deities. It's like a cosmic rebranding exercise, where the new good defines itself by demonizing the old.
A demonization of the past, then.
Precisely. New ideas, new religious movements, new enthusiasms, they all get attached to these names from the past that carry negative baggage. This creates conflict, a real battle between the old and the new.
Right. And this clash often leads to those accusations of being in league with the devil, right?
Absolutely.
Like we see this throughout history.
All the time. For example, the accusation, he casteth out devils through Beelzebub, shows this. Or Tertullian saying, Satan is God's ape. And even Augustine acknowledging a similarity between the two, it all points to this dynamic of associating the new with the old rejected figures.
I get it. So it's not just about rejecting the old ideas, it's about actively associating them with something considered evil or demonic.
Right. The new ideal eventually wins out, turning the old one into something like an idol that's been cast down. But here's the catch. The new system often develops its own superstitions, its own ways of controlling and manipulating, though it might not be as obvious at first.
It's like a cycle.
It is, in a way. And what about the old idol, like Satan? Does he just disappear?
I guess not.
You guessed right. Usually the old idol gets integrated into the new system somehow. They might become this great second best to the new god, a scapegoat to blame for everything that goes wrong.
Like the ultimate cosmic fall guy.
Precisely. And this fear of this fallen figure becomes a powerful tool to keep people in line, to maintain devotion. You don't want to end up like him, do you?
Makes sense. Now, the text mentions traces of these ancient conflicts even way back in the Vedic age in India. How does that early history connect to the devil figure?
This takes us to the story of Viswamitra and Vasishtha, two powerful seers, or rishis, in ancient India. They represent this early tension within Hinduism itself. Viswamitra is aligned with the priestly class and their ambitions for power, while Vasishtha represents a more authentic anti-sacerdotal spirit, meaning he was against the priests having all the power. And their hymns, their sacred poems, reflect these opposing views.
So even in these really early religious expressions, you've got this internal conflict, this struggle for power and influence.
Exactly.
Now, what were their hymns like?
Well, Viswamitra's hymns often celebrated the Soma sacrifice, this ritual that involved a sacred drink, and he emphasized the power and virtues of this soma plant. And this aligns with the growing influence of the priestly class at the time. There's even this story of rivers miraculously stopping their flow for Viswamitra, kind of like Moses parting the Red Sea.
Showcasing his power then.
Exactly, those miracles associated with religious authority.
And Vasishta.
Now, Vasishta's hymns are considered some of the finest in the Vedas, the ancient Hindu scriptures.
Right.
They're known for their moral depth and beauty. But what's interesting is that Vasishta's hymns often reveal his skepticism towards the priestly class and their thirst for power. He even wrote a satirical hymn about frogs, which is seen as a jab at the empty ritualism of the priests.
So he was using humor to critique religious hypocrisy.
Yeah, exactly. He was a sharp critic of those who used religion for their own personal gain.
I like him already.
He's a fascinating figure, a real champion of truth and authenticity.
And how does the story of Harishchandra fit into all of this?
This story is really about the clash between political power and unwavering truthfulness. It's a test of integrity. King Harishchandra is pushed to his absolute limits by Viswamitra, who's trying to make him break a vow and renounce a debt. This poor guy loses his kingdom, his wealth, even his son, yet he never gives up his commitment to truth.
Talk about a trial by fire.
Right. It's brutal. Harishchandra, his wife Chandravati, and their son Devarata, they endure incredible hardship, poverty, slavery, even the death of their child. But through it all, Harishchandra never utters a falsehood, even when he's offered everything back.
Wow. That's true dedication to principle.
It is a powerful example of moral strength in the face of overwhelming adversity.
Now, the text then goes on to examine some instances in the Old Testament where God himself seems to engage in deception. Doesn't that kind of complicate things?
It does.
Like, it challenges that clear-cut good versus evil, God versus devil dynamic, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. It raises questions about the nature of divine action and the very definition of evil. For example, you have stories like Jacob deceiving his brother Esau and yet receiving blessings from Jehovah. Or David, who, with divine approval, essentially steals Nabal's wife and property after Nabal insults him.
Oh, wow. Okay, that is pretty morally ambiguous.
It is, and perhaps the most striking example is the passage in 1 Kings 22, where Jehovah himself instructs a lying spirit to deceive King Ahab through his prophets.
That's pretty intense.
It is. It really makes you think about how the lines between good and evil, truth and deception might have been much blurrier in these earlier narratives.
So like they were still working out the whole good versus evil thing.
Exactly. And this ambiguity carries over into early Christian thought as well. Paul, for example, talks about this mystery of iniquity, this idea of a man of sin who, while opposing Christ, is somehow still seen as part of God's larger plan. This is a complex and evolving understanding of evil, one that doesn't always fit into neat categories.
So we have this idea of divinely sanctioned deception.
Exactly.
Even lying spirits being sent out to influence human affairs.
It was a part of their worldview, and it raises questions about the very nature of free will and divine intervention that theologians have been debating for centuries.
It's mind-boggling. Now let's revisit the Garden of Eden story, but with a twist.
Right.
The text suggests using the original older names instead of the familiar ones. What's the point of that?
By replacing names like Serpent, Eve, Adam, and God with their earlier counterparts Rahu, Adaya Sakti, Adima, and the Devas, we get a different perspective on the whole fall of man narrative. It becomes less about disobedience and more about knowledge and power.
Okay. Tell me more about that.
So in this version, Rahu steals and tastes this sacred drink called soma, which is associated with immortality, and he's punished by being forced to crawl and eat dirt. The Devas, these divine beings, are afraid of humanity becoming their equals, gaining the same knowledge and potentially even immortality through the Amrita, the drink of eternal life. So they banish Adima and Adaya Supti from this paradise called Meru and place guards, including a sinuous darting flame, which represents Rahu in his transformed serpent-like form to protect the Amrita.
So the expulsion from the garden is less about punishing a specific act of disobedience and more about the gods being afraid of humanity's potential.
Exactly, yeah. They're not necessarily angry, they're just trying to maintain their own power and prevent humans from becoming too powerful themselves. It adds a whole new layer of complexity to the story.
It really does. Now, let's talk about Eve. She gets a lot of blame for the whole fall thing, doesn't she?
She does.
But is that really fair?
That's a good question. The text actually points out that the early Hebrew Bible doesn't have a fully formed fall of man narrative as we know it today. There's a general sense of human fallibility, but it's not all pinned on Eve.
I see.
Now, there were these superstitious theories about heredity, like the idea that the actions of our ancestors can affect us today. But interestingly, rabbinical tradition says that the devil and woman entered the world simultaneously.
Simultaneously.
Yeah, it even says the devil emerged from the space where Adam's rib was removed.
That's a pretty wild idea.
It is. And then there's this idea that Eve represents the passional nature of woman.
Oh,
This idea that women are more driven by emotion and desire, which might have been seen as a weakness for tribes trying to maintain their purity and identity.
so it's more of a social concern than a theological one.
Right, a fear of mixing with other groups and diluting their own lineage. We see this reflected in stories like Abraham's oath for his servant to find a wife from his own people.
It's all about keeping it in the family then.
Yeah, maintaining that pure bloodline. The stories of Eve and Sarah, who was given to Jehovah despite being childless at first, can also be seen through this lens. It's about establishing a divinely chosen lineage, separate from other groups.
It makes you wonder how much of these stories are about spiritual matters and how much is just about tribal politics and power struggles.
That's the question, isn't it? Separating the divine from the human is never easy, especially when you're dealing with ancient texts and myths.
So true. Now, the text then brings up giants and fallen angels. How do they fit into this whole demonology thing?
These figures, like the Rephaim and Anakim in the Bible or the Ehis and Vritras in Hindu mythology, they all represent this primordial, chaotic force.
Kind of like the Titans in Greek mythology.
Exactly, yeah. Powerful beings who predate the current order, often associated with chaos and destruction.
So where do they come from?
Well, in Hebrew tradition, they're linked to the Elohim, which can refer to these powerful beings, sometimes interpreted as these wilder nature gods, distinct from Jehovah himself.
I see. So even God has his rivals.
Right. And these giants, they're seen as a threat to the divine order, something that needs to be subdued or even destroyed. Later, their origin gets connected to the idea of a fall from grace, angels who rebelled against God and were cast down to earth.
So they become another category of demonic beings.
Exactly.
Another layer in the cosmic hierarchy of evil.
Yeah.
Now, what about this detail about the serpent in Eden sometimes being depicted with a woman's head and body? That's a strange one.
Yeah, it is.
What's going on there?
This imagery shows up in early religious art, and even in some frescoes, like the one by Pietro d'Orvieto. It's really striking because it further complicates our understanding of the serpent as this purely evil reptilian figure. And then you have Michelangelo's portrayal of Lilith, this mythical first wife of Adam, in the Sistine Chapel. She's depicted as even more beautiful than Eve, further linking female figures to temptation and this primal, alluring force.
So it's like a merging of these different ideas about women, temptation, and the nature of evil itself. It's all intertwined in the artistic imagination.
Absolutely. And this brings us to the whole theme of temptation.
Yeah, that's a big one.
It is.
It's at the heart of so many religious stories, isn't it?
It is, like the devil tempting Jesus with power over all the kingdoms of the world. This reflects a broader belief in many religions that the earthly realm itself is somehow satanic or corrupted, in contrast to a pure divine realm somewhere else.
And that leads to people trying to escape this earthly realm through asceticism and things like that.
Precisely.
Denying the physical world to reach a higher spiritual plane.
Exactly.
Now, is this temptation thing just a Christian or Abrahamic thing?
No, not at all. The Buddhist figure of Mara plays a similar role to Satan as a tempter.
Oh, really? I didn't know that.
Yeah, Mara is associated with death, the god of love, and sometimes illusion. He tempts the Buddha under the Bodhi tree with all sorts of scary shapes and sounds, but the Buddha resists, relying on his accumulated merits to overcome these temptations.
That's a powerful story. So even in Buddhism, you have this idea of an external force trying to pull you away from enlightenment.
Absolutely. It's a universal struggle.
Wow. Now, how did medieval art and folklore depict the devil?
They really went all out. They had these vivid and often pretty grotesque depictions. There's this account of a puppet show in Tours that showed hell with devils, judges, and all sorts of punishments. It's interesting because it contrasts so sharply with the real-life horrors that were happening in Europe at the time, like the torture and executions.
The real-life hell was almost worse than the imagined one.
It's a chilling thought. And speaking of real-life horrors, the text also mentions the tradition of the scapegoat, the idea of transferring sin and impurity onto an animal and then sacrificing it.
Right, like a Zazel.
Exactly. It's
Right.
a ritualistic way of dealing with guilt and fear.
Trying to cleanse the community by projecting their sins onto something else.
Precisely. And then there's the story of Jacob and Esau, which is analyzed as this separation of human and theological myths. Jehovah cursing Esau while Isaac blesses him. It shows these competing narratives, different agendas at play.
So even within the Bible, you have these contradictions and complexities. Now, what about this idea of a more dignified devil? Where does that come from?
This is really interesting. It seems that the fierce resistance of the pagan cultures in Northern Europe to Christianity actually led to a more respectful view of Satan among some within the church. They saw the bravery and devotion of these pagans, even the sense of justice in their beliefs, and it forced them to reevaluate their own assumptions about the devil.
So the enemy of my enemy is, well, not exactly my friend, but maybe not a total monster either.
Yeah. They started to see Satan as this powerful potentate, a rival king with his own moral code and a system of justice among his subjects, who were seen as the pagan kings. This is reflected in some ancient Russian frescoes, where Satan is depicted with a grandeur similar to God, sometimes even looking like him. There are even instances where Satan is shown supporting Judas, the betrayer of Christ.
That's a far cry from the devil as this purely evil, demonic figure.
It is. It suggests a grudging respect, a recognition of a worthy adversary.
Wow. And then there's Martin Luther, who had some pretty intense personal encounters with the devil, right?
Yeah. Martin Luther really believed in the devil's real and active presence in the world. There's that famous story of him throwing his inkwell at the devil in the Wartburg Castle. Whether it really happened or not, it shows how real the devil was to Luther. And his statements about not fearing the devil, about the devil being a more formidable adversary than any human ruler, really highlight the intensity of his beliefs and the spiritual battles he felt he was fighting.
It's a very personal and dramatic portrayal of the struggle against evil.
It is. And it shows how this idea of the devil can become deeply embedded in someone's worldview, shaping their actions and even their understanding of themselves.
Absolutely. Now let's move on to the legend of the Wild Huntsman. What's that all about?
This is a fascinating one, a legend that's found all over Europe, especially in Germany. It's considered a remnant of the ancient Odin myth.
Odin, the Norse god.
That's the one. The Wild Huntsman is usually seen as the ghost of a wicked lord or king who is punished for some sacrilegious act, usually related to hunting. He's condemned to lead this ghostly hunt through the sky until the day of judgment.
That sounds terrifying.
It is. He's usually depicted with a broad-brimmed hat, followed by a pack of spectral hounds and all sorts of other creatures, like fiery phantom animals and the souls of unbaptized children.
Whoa.
And it's said that if you hear the wild hunt approaching, you better get out of the way, because encountering them can mean bad luck, even death.
I'll keep that in mind.
And the horse plays a big role in this myth.
Oh yeah, horses are big in Norse mythology.
Exactly. The horse was sacred to the ancient Germanic tribes, associated with divination, fertility, and the gods. You have figures like Hengist and Horsa, whose names literally mean horse, and the Veil of the White Horse in England, all pointing to this deep reverence for the horse. And Norse mythology is full of famous horses like Sleipnir, Odin's eight-legged steed.
Cool. But how did the horse get connected to this ghostly wild hunt?
Well, as Christianity spread, the horse became associated with the old pagan ways. St. Olaf even condemned the eating of horse flesh as a heathen practice. So the horse, this once sacred animal, gets demonized and linked to the supernatural and the forbidden.
It's like a symbol of the clash between the old religion and the new.
Exactly. And there's also the figure of the White Lady, who's often linked to the Wild Huntsman.
Oh yeah.
She's usually depicted as being pursued by him, desperately trying to escape.
That's intense.
It is. And she's connected to figures like the storm god Woden and the goddess Frigga, who later gets associated with St. Walpurga. It's like these old pagan deities are being hunted down by the forces of Christianity, forced to flee or hide.
So the wild hunt is like a metaphor for the suppression of the old ways.
Yeah, a powerful image of religious and cultural change.
Now this next one is pretty wild.
Yeah.
What about the idea of the devil being redeemed?
It is a radical notion.
It is.
But it's an idea that keeps popping up throughout Christian history, this idea of universal restoration of all beings, even the devil, eventually being reconciled with God.
That's a very different image from the devil being eternally damned in hell.
It is.
So where do we see this idea?
Well, you have Paul's statement that God may be all in all, and there's a story of the 70 disciples who come back saying that even the demons are subject to them.
Wow. Okay.
There's also the legend of the satyr asking St. Anthony to pray for his demonic tribe.
I never heard that one.
It's a really interesting story, and it shows that this idea of demonic redemption was circulating, even among some of the early church fathers.
So not everyone saw the devil as this irredeemable evil.
Exactly.
Now, what about the more popular view of the devil?
For a lot of people, especially those who were marginalized or oppressed, the devil wasn't so much a figure of potential redemption, but more like a symbol of resistance against their Christian oppressors.
Like a Robin Hood of hell.
Yeah. They saw him as the prince of the world, the one who stood up to the powers that be. They even gave him qualities of justice and kindness, things they felt were lacking in the church. There are all these legends of the devil helping the poor, aiding skilled workers, even defending the innocent.
Like they reclaimed the devil, made him their champion.
Exactly. He became a symbol of their own struggle against injustice. Now, speaking of champions, the devil has had a lot of different looks over the years, hasn't he?
Yeah, from bestial to human-like and everything in between.
It's amazing how many different forms he's taken. The color black is often associated with him and his followers in art, representing darkness and evil. We see him blowing a horn in scenes of Christ delivering souls from purgatory. And with the rise of Christianity, a lot of the old pagan household gods were demonized and incorporated into the devil's retinue. But those animalistic features never really went away. Mephistopheles appearing as a dog is a classic example.
All right.
And it's interesting how the image of the devil changed over time. The early ascetic devils were all gaunt and emaciated, reflecting the emphasis on self-denial.
Right.
But later, you get these fat, gluttonous devils who embody the sins of the wealthy and the corrupt clergy.
It's like the devil himself got a makeover.
He did. And Persian art even shows Ahriman and Iblis combined into this red, dragon-crested figure ruling over fish-like devils in a lake of fire.
Wow. It's a vivid image.
It is. It just shows how endlessly creative humans have been in imagining the devil and his domain.
Absolutely. Now, this is a strange one, but could the devil actually have played a role in human progress?
It's a provocative thought, isn't it?
It is.
The mystic Jacob Boehme said that Satan's downfall came from wanting to be an artist.
Okay.
So there's this link between the devil and the allure of knowledge and creativity. And if you think about it, the church's suppression of learning and science throughout history, ironically, kind of echoes the serpent's role in the Garden of Eden, offering forbidden knowledge that leads to a kind of awakening.
Interesting.
And then there's the case of Seth, who was initially associated with the Egyptian god Set, who was linked to science and magic. Later, Seth is redeemed and becomes this wise author and originator of the arts. It's a complicated relationship between knowledge, transgression, and progress.
It really is. It makes you wonder if pushing boundaries, even those labeled as demonic or evil, is sometimes necessary for human advancement.
That's a question worth pondering.
Now, let's get into the compact with the devil. What are the key elements of this enduring concept?
Well, the idea of making a pact with the devil seems to draw on a bunch of different traditions, both pagan and Christian. You have the Odinistic self-dedication rituals, where people would offer themselves to Odin, and the use of blood was a big deal in both pagan and Christian rites. Then you have the spread of astrology and the invocation of different deities, which probably contributed to the idea of making deals with supernatural entities. And the ambiguity around the book mentioned in the Salem witch trials suggests a pre-existing understanding of a pact with the devil.
So it's like all these threads came together to create this idea of a formal agreement with the devil, often sealed with blood.
Exactly. And this concept has fueled so many stories and fears throughout history. It speaks to this deep human anxiety about the potential consequences of seeking forbidden knowledge or power.
Absolutely. Now, finally, let's reflect on the lasting impact of the devil as this cultural and religious figure. What's his legacy?
Well, the text argues that in modern times, the fear of hell and the promise of heaven might not be the main things controlling our behavior anymore.
Yeah, I think that's true.
Things like social customs, our sense of morality, the rule of law, they all play a much bigger role.
So what about the devil? Is he irrelevant now?
Not necessarily. Goethe's Faust presents a really nuanced view of the devil, not as pure evil, but as a force of negation, a spirit of denial that paradoxically pushes us towards progress and self-discovery.
Right. Mephistopheles, that spirit that evermore denies.
Exactly. And he makes us ask, how can we know truth if we don't question, if we don't challenge the status quo? How can we progress if we're not willing to embrace a little bit of discontent?
That's a powerful thought. So the devil in a way, forces us to confront our own limitations and assumptions.
He does, he does. He makes us question everything, even the very nature of good and evil.
Well, as we wrap up this deep dive into the history of the devil, it's clear that this figure has been a constantly evolving reflection of our deepest fears, our aspirations, and our understanding of the world. From those ancient dragons to the subtle tempters, the devil's many forms reveal this fundamental human need to grapple with the problem of evil, to understand where it comes from and what it means for us. The sources we've explored today have given us a glimpse into this incredibly complex tapestry of belief, a tapestry that's been woven across cultures and throughout history.
And it's important to remember that this exploration is just the beginning. There's so much more to discover.
Absolutely. So we encourage you to keep digging, to keep questioning, to keep